It's been a little while since the Magic Spotlight series made its event debut in Atlanta a little earlier this month, but with so many players in the room, it's still going to take a little while before people dig through all of the results and all of the decks that were played, myself included when I looked at the entire list. When I did my recap video a couple of weeks ago, I did wind up highlighting a lot of high win rate decks, such as the Esper Aristocrats combo deck that was featured in my last deck tech, but also what a lot of my friends like to call Tom decks is where I'm starting to turn my eye to. Now, these decks can range from things that are the most dirtily of mid-range decks to the more convoluted decks looking to take steps to arrive at a conclusion that other decks might do sooner or just straight up better. Most of these wind up being Black X decks, and one in particular by pilot Brian Zeng really caught my eye when I was going through the MSS lists. It had an interesting 9-win, 2-loss, and 4-draw record overall, meaning it didn't quite hit my top win rate decks, but this Golgari Mill combo synergy, reanimation, everything but Vraska's kitchen sink really spoke to me, and I've been grinding away with it on Arena in my spare time. So grab a shovel and let's dig into a standard deck tech on Golgari Roots. Now, if you've talked to me about some off-meta or pet decks that I've had before, you probably already know that I wind up having a soft spot for Tyvar Jubilant Brawler in the Pioneer format. While Standard doesn't offer us the chance to play my other favorite card in this deck, Priest of Forgotten Gods, it does let us play around with another card that Tyvar loves to see in their decks, Insidious Roots. These two cards create a powerful engine for this deck, as every creature Tyvar brings back from the graveyard will create a plant token, pumping up all of the tokens on board in doing so. Tyvar's passive ability then grants these tokens the chance to immediately tap for mana, allowing you to continue your cycle of graveyard-based shenanigans and get rewarded with a plant and an extra mana every time you do so. We pack a full 4 copies of each of these cards in our list so that we can build around them with the rest of our deck. Although not strictly part of the engine of our deck, I want to mention the 3 copies of Scavenging Ooze early in this deck tech because the card has impressed me the most with this shell. Not only a hate card against opposing graveyard decks, and not just a life battery when you're being beat down by aggro, Scooze itself is a 1 Ooze army when you have Tyvar and Roots in play. So it brings a lot of backup. Now, being able to trigger Roots off of the Ooze grows basically your entire board for 1 green mana, then also gains you a life in the process. This allows for some really funky turns when we get to milling ourselves and making as many plants as we pay mana for, which has been the way I've won some games most with this deck on Arena. Now, I've considered using Keen Eye Curator in this slot before, playing the deck to mitigate the cost of the green mana since we run a decent amount of basic swamps, but the life gain has been a big bonus to Scooze, while I'm able to avoid needing to spend a few mana exiling non-creatures to turn on the pump up passive from the Curator. Cash Grab functions like a Grizzly salvage, but even better for our deck, as the instant speed mill spell allows us to get back any permanent from the cards we mill, not just creatures or lands. That means casting this to find an Insidious Roots or a Tyvar is fair game, which leads us to hands with Cash Grab and one piece of our engine being totally reasonable keeps. The upside to this card over other effects like this is that it can be played at instant speed, allowing us to hold up mana for interaction on our opponent's turn and make them play around things, allowing us to cash grab freely at the end of their turn. Remember, bringing a creature back to our hand will trigger Insidious Roots. It doesn't have to be put into play right away. So, Cash Grab nets us a plant token if the enchantment is in play. Our creature package helps out with not just fueling our graveyard, but finding ways to trigger Insidious Roots as well. Rebel Belt, Maverick, and Llanowar Elves are a pair of 1-drops that help fuel our main game plan, with Elves giving us the ability to power out a turn 2 Tyvar and continuing to produce free mana when they pop out of the graveyard to make a plant token. Rebel Belt Maverick is a crucial card in a slightly different role, as the 1-drop human has Surveil 2 as it enters the battlefield effect, which can allow us to set up turns where we get things back with a Cash Grab or Tyvar and trigger our Insidious Roots. but the creature itself can trigger Roots so long as there is another creature to target with its Exile from the Graveyard ability. Yep, that's right. Roots doesn't care how it leaves the yard, it just needs to go away in order for the enchantment to trigger. This also allows us to buff up some of our other creatures in the list to become larger blockers or push through a tiny bit of damage in a pinch. Brood Spinner is one of those cards that makes an excellent target for Maverick's +1/+1 counter, as the 2/3 with reach can block most things pretty successfully with its 1 extra toughness added. Another Surveil 2 when it enters, Brood Spinner plays defense extremely well, while also threatening to turn itself into an army of flying tokens when the need arises. Now, as we go through the rest of the deck, we'll see how we can hit Delirium or beyond quite easily thanks to all the different enchantments, planeswalkers, and of course the self-mill effects we have to put them there. So Brood Spinner is often going to be popping for more damage than it normally deals itself, or creating more chump blockers for most of a board whenever it swings at you when you decide to activate it and make it explode into little flying insects. Overlord of the Baelmerk finds itself a new home in a standard deck as an eventual threat that can help fill our graveyard and find things we need like Tyvar in the process. Now, it's another mill 4 effect, but at sorcery speed. Overlord of the Baelmerk doesn't need to mill the thing in those 4 cards to bring it back to your hand, unlike Cash Grab. So, we're not as sad about its restriction being limited to non-avatar creatures and planeswalkers for this effect, because we could just surveil something away to find a much needed land, and that becomes way less of a liability when we can just recur it a turn later, or, make a plant token and play it that exact same turn for 2 mana off of our impending cost on the Overlord. Not to mention that the avatar gets cast the old-fashioned way quite frequently, thanks to just the sheer number of plant tokens that we can generate. Likewise, the ability of the Overlord also triggers Insidious Roots itself to make plants, like I said. So whenever we bring a creature back from our graveyard, we're making a plant off of our Overlord. Whenever we put something in there on turn number 1 and then, impending it back on turn number 3, we're making plants. And then at some point in time, we could just cast our subsequent Overlord. So this one is a stacking effect that fuels our engine and overall is a very powerful card. Thornbolt Forager is a curious, squirrely inclusion to the deck, as a 2-mana mana dork needs to do a little bit more than tap for any color of mana when Llanowar Elves is sitting right there in the 1 mana slot waving at it. Forager in this case won't be searching for other squirrels, unfortunately, but we will be using the Forage ability in order to generate 2 mana by itself, and a 3rd from a plant token when it exiles a creature as part of the Forage cost. That means we can generate a combination of colors to cast whatever spell we have in our hand, with a Thornvault Forager and a plant together being able to make 3 different colors of mana to cast the top end threats of our deck. Atraxa Grand Unifier. Yeah, I know, I'm skipping up the curve a little bit and bouncing around, but all these tokens do more than slowly grow and get blocked. They can be used to cast large threats way ahead of the curve. Now, Brian ran 2 of the Phyrexian Angels, while I've bumped my list up to 3 to make sure I see one every game possible, since even if the giant 7/7 gets returned to my hand, being bounced, I've gotten a ton of value off of the ETB trigger since we have tons of different card types in our deck. It's very difficult to get less than 4 cards if an Atraxa hits the battlefield. Now, to go hand in hand with this self-mill and the Atraxa itself, we don't need to just hardcast Atraxa. We have 4 copies of Squirming Emergence. Now, this reanimation spell gets the nod over cards like Zombify for 2 main reasons. The first one is the casting cost, and while we can all see that 3 is smaller than 4, Squirmergence's downside has often been that you need to have permanence equal to or greater than the converted mana cost of what you want to bring back, while Zombify costs 1 extra mana to just bring it back without the stipulations attached. But our deck is consistently putting cards into the graveyard, with only 4 of them being instants and 4 of them being sorceries. So we can basically ignore the stipulation after casting a Surveil creature, a Cash Grab, and using Tyvar once. That'll get us to 7 permanents super easy. The second is the fact that Squirmergence can get any permanent back from our graveyard. So milling over an Insidious Roots is not a deal breaker, as the low converted mana cost is easy for us to hit the cap on, And Emergence can bring it back to the battlefield. Of course, the main thing here is being able to reanimate an Overlord of the Baelmerk or an Atraxa as early as turn 3 or 4 to really put the pressure on our opponent, sometimes ending the game outright without even showing our engine game plan. Lastly, there is a singleton copy of Skyfisher Spider in the main deck from Brian, which I've actually utilized for my extra Atraxa spot. The Spider has additional copy in the sideboard, being a catch-all answer to threats and hate pieces for the low cost of putting a Rubber Belt Maverick into the yard or sacrificing a tap token. This card overall is well worth the investment, and I've just been playing around with the numbers in my deck. The Die's ability to gain a bunch of life in the face of aggro decks is a really nice perk, so as long as you can avoid touching their Screaming Nemesis in the process of blocking, that should shore up a lot of those aggressive early matchups that you may struggle with. The land base of our deck is going to be skewed towards the low converted mana cost of a lot of our plays, since most of the deck can be played for 3 or less. That means packing a decent number of basics, as this is standard after all, 6 forests and 4 swamps being the division here, alongside the full 4 copies of our fast land Blooming Marsh as our 14 untapped painless lands on turns 1 to 3. I mentioned painless since we have 4 copies of Llanowar Wastes in the deck as well, which bumps the count of untapped sources up to 18 in total, 14 green ones and 12 black ones, doing the math to make Frank Karsten proud, as we don't actually have main deck black spells at 1 mana. Now, we also only run a singleton Underground Mortuary, although you'd be tempted to run more with the ability to surveil fodder for our engine into the graveyard. However, having an untapped mana early is more important to getting the engine online overall, so we cut down on the number of enters the battlefield tapped lands in order to compensate for this. Likewise, we only have a singleton creature land in our 1 copy of Restless Cottage, which can in a pinch exile a creature from our own graveyard when attacking to put some extra plants into play or counters onto them for doing combat math. Lastly, we have a single Fountain Port, mainly as a way to turn our Sea of Plant tokens into card draw, although it still has its other uses, making fish and treasures and just being able to play a longer game from our mana base. The sideboard of the deck allows us to get a little more grindy while also ensuring that we have enough answers to the things our opponent will be throwing at us. As you've surely noticed, our deck is a little weak to graveyard hate, so cards like Maelstrom Pulse, Haywire Might, Canker Bloom, and Tranquil Frillback can help deal with opposing artifacts and enchantments that shut off that avenue of attack and value from our deck. Haywire Might and Canker Bloom are also recurring threats with Tyvar's -2 ability, while Canker Bloom can also allow us to proliferate Tyvar and our plant army. Frillback has more uses outside of the hate piece removal, gaining us life, exiling the opposing graveyard, or doing all 3 at once with the plethora of plant mana that we can make. Along the same lines as Maelstrom Pulse, we have copies of Anoint with Affliction and Cut Down as extra removal spells to help deal with the more aggressive decks, as we do need a couple of turns to set our deck up for success. 2 copies of Harvester of Misery and Glissa Sunslayer are also ways to stopgap aggressive decks while providing advantages for us in other ways. Harvester in particular is a great target to bring back with Squirming Emergence against decks like Jeskai Convoke, and is just as easy to cast as Overlord of the Baelmerk can be. Glissa does great against opposing decks with their own Overlords, as she can destroy them in combat or threaten to kill them upon dealing damage with her triggered ability. Maelstrom Pulse also works wonders against aggressive decks, as it can remove multiple copies of tokens or multiple mice in one fell swoop. Now, Dissection Tools has been a card floating around in some sideboards, creating a manifest token as it enters to give us a 4/4 life-licking, death-touching body. The equip activation is a slight bonus for our deck, as putting smaller creatures into the graveyard will allow us to continuously trigger our Insidious Roots. Now, no matter how we use it though, the tools are a great anti-aggro card, cutting things down in their tracks, buffing our life total if possible, and securing trades thanks to Death Touch. A pair of powerful planeswalkers round out our sideboard, with Liliana of the Veil giving us some long game against midrange and control decks, while Nissa, Ascended Animist, is a way to give our army of plant tokens an overrun effect that will most of the time grant at least +1/+1 in trample, with a total of 7 forests in our deck to find. This is yet another good way to break up some of the mid-range stalls, or something along the lines of like a mono-white life gain or tokens generating deck, where you could just trample over everything with your ever-increasing number of army of plant tokens. Play patterns with the Roots deck are going to really depend on your opening hand, as the deck functions entirely different ways when it has some, all, or 0 of its main engine pieces. Knowing when to mulligan away a hand is going to make a world of difference between the games you feel like you have a chance in and games where you don't even get to turn the key to start your engine. I'm personally still learning what the best and worst hands to keep are, but in general, we're going to want to see a hand that has Tyvar, Insidious Roots, and ways to trigger Roots. That makes sense. A lot of the time, this involves cards like Rubblebelt Maverick and Scavenging Ooze, which alongside 3 lands would be a pretty good start to your game. But that doesn't mean that keeping a hand with Llanowar Elves, Tyvar, and Cash Grab to find Roots after your turn to Tyvar is bad either. Just a little more up to RNGesus than our sequencing of plays. Now, it's hard to pinpoint what a nut draw for this deck would look like, since there could be a couple of variations on it. However, I think the best case scenario that I've personally encountered would be a turn 4 or 5 almost kill, where you're able to take your first 3 turns setting up your engine and go off to the races on that 3rd or 4th turn. Rubblebelt Maverick putting some fodder into our graveyard turn 1, followed up by an Insidious Roots the following turn, and then slamming Tyvar, milling to get back a Scavenging Ooze, and having a maximum of 4 activations with our fast tapping plants thanks to Tyvar can be achieved if we hit only creatures in our 5 total mills, one of which will be our SCGCON itself. This will give you 5 plant tokens, with the largest being a 6/7, so 21 damage from just plants alone, with SCGCON being a 6 power creature itself, and I guess the one from the Rubblebelt Maverick as well. You just need that extra turn to untap and swing, or do it all at the end of your opponent's turn. That would be the way to win on turn 4, but if you mill just 1 non-creature spell in those other 4 cards, you go down to 15 damage in plants and 5 from SCGCON itself, exactly 20 if there are no blockers. So it's more likely you'll need an additional turn or extra mills to beef up the team for more of a lethal swing. Now, if we take our minds out of the magical Christmas land and back to reality, our deck gives us a lot of important choices extremely early on. Once we decide on a keepable hand, we have the question of sequencing. Is it better to play a turn 1 Llanowar Elves or a turn 1 Rubblebelt Maverick? What is better if I have a Cash Grab instead of an Insidious Roots? Do I decide to play Tyvar and mill right away, or do I untap my elf and wait? There are a lot of decisions that will 100% change the way the game plays out for you, and that can include losing or winning in just a couple of turns after that. But don't fret, the deck has ways to recover as well as the synergy within the individual parts in order to stay alive through a stumble. Now, going back to our turn 1 example, depending on our hand, it may be wise to play the turn 1 elf if we can turn to Tyvar, untap our elf for protection, and mill the following turn after we play an Impending Overlord of the Baelmerg or Cash Grab that finds us an Insidious Roots. Likewise, it may be better still to play the elf if we have a Black Source and Roots in hand, so we can play Roots and Maverick on turn 2, block with the Maverick to get us a plant for sure in the next turn. Maverick on turn 1 may be correct if we have no other mill effects in our hand, so we need a 3rd land drop and we're afraid of our elf dying to a shock or something. So if it takes some reps to figure out your optimal play patterns, while multiple lines have valid game plan progressing reasons to be taken. Now, in general, and not just with this deck specifically, a lot of people ask me about Tyvar and when to immediately minus him the turn that he enters the battlefield. It's a little obvious to do so if you've set up your graveyard with something worth bringing back, and it's equally as obvious to not mill right away if you surveilled and left cards you want to draw on top of your library. However, on an empty battlefield or one with just an elf on my side, I personally will more often than not minus my Tyvar. I know it might not be correct, but if I don't have any other mill effects in my hand, I like being able to get back a 2-drop like Brood Spinner and set up my next few draws, even if that means potentially missing a plant token the following turn if I draw an Insidious Roots. Heck, I might not have even found that Roots if I didn't mill 3 and Surveil 2. Now, of course, there's an equal amount of punishment here, like milling my Insidious Roots and missing out on creatures entirely. But I do also have Squirming Emergence to bail me out and get my Roots back. I should probably advise going up with Tyvar if you play it with a Roots in hand, as the secured activation on the next turn means making a plant and making your Roots essentially cost 1 mana instead of 2. Now, there's also a good argument surrounding figuring out when you have an angle of attack that should be digging for your engine pieces versus having the play big Phyrexian be your win condition. It makes a lot of sense to do your plan A of Roots plus Tyvar whenever you have one of them in your hand. But when you have a hand that's a bunch of Milt spells, an Elf, or Squirming Emergence, it's hard to pass up that Reanimation as a plan when we have a 37.5% chance to find an Atraxa through drawing 3 and milling 8. But when you think about it more, drawing the card would actually be pretty bad there, since we have no way to self-discard in our main deck, just Lilia on the sideboard, and we have no plants on the board to create the colored mana we need to cast it. So the math is actually less likely since it's not a straight mill 8, so we end up having a 14.9% chance to mill on the first mill, and a 16.5% chance to mill on the second mill if we are to play or hit the Atraxa. That's with 2 Atraxas in the main deck, by the way. My third copy version has a 21.7% and a 23.9% chance, respectively, in the same scenario to hit it. Basically, all that math is telling you is that you don't even have the statistical chance of hitting 1 in 3 games of your best of 3 if you play for this line. So it's more correct to play your normal game plan and have this be a bonus later on down the line. Milling to find an Insidious Roots or Tyvar to Squirmerge back into play while giving you additional value through plants and creatures on board is a lot more solid than doing nothing but looking for a 7/7 that could potentially get bounced in a matchup where this town ain't big enough is in the cards. We also have the option of just returning Atraxa to our hand with Overlord and casting it off of our plants later if we play to our engine. So, like Hannah Montana, we could get the best of both worlds. Now, this obviously isn't everything in the deck, as there's a lot of moving parts and just a lot of different scenarios that can kind of come up, but these are just some of those scenarios that I've encountered after playing maybe like 50 games myself between best of 1 and best of 3 in Arena, and to be honest, like half of those are on my iPad in bed, so I'm not always remembering the exact scenarios or optimizing my plays myself, which gets me into some of these situations, which goes to show that the deck will require a decent amount of games invested into it in order to figure out how to really play optimally all the time, and probably a little bit more brain power than some of the other decks out there might take. Now, I normally give you estimates on how many matches you should play before you wind up taking the deck and jumping into like an RCQ with it, but this one is kind of more of a feeling more than a science, I guess. When you wind up putting time into the deck and feel good about when to mill, when to play to the board, and when to go for your reanimation angle, you should feel alright taking it to a more important event. Being a rogue deck in the room too, so not the creature type, but you know, like the unknown factor of it, means that you're going to have knowledge of what you're facing off against, and that's going to pay off immensely when your opponents don't entirely know what your deck is doing or have an idea of what your deck even is, especially in game number 1s. The other big thing is going to be, you probably want to play this deck in paper a couple of times before you bring it to a big event. One, so you make sure you have enough tokens to use things for, or enough dice for everything, because you are going to have +1/+1 counters and counters for plant tokens, so that's going to be a bit of a mess. And 2, to make sure that you don't miss any of the triggers from the deck, and that you are putting counters on absolutely every single plant that you have in play. Now, hitting upon that point about some matchup knowledge a little bit further, we do have a little bit of information about how Brian actually did at the MSS, but it's not going to be a comprehensive matchup matrix or anything like that, especially since Brian wound up taking 2 intentional and 2 unintentional draws in the course of the tournament. Now, wins for Brian's deck came against Orzhov Midrange, Gruul Aggro, Mono White Caretaker's Talent, Simic Beanstalk, the Dimir Otters combo deck, Domain Control, and a total of a 3-0 record against Dimir midrange lists. The losses wound up coming against 2 aggro decks, Gruul in round number 14, and a Rakdos version of the same style of deck, where it actually went up to Shieldred and Preacher of the Schism in round number 1 overall. There were 2 unintentional draws that happened against a Sultai Beanstalk deck and a Dimir midrange deck there. So while intentional draws were taken against Golgari to make day number 2 and against Gruul in the final round of the tournament to wind up ending it, the record kind of shows that this deck was very well catered towards a specific type of matchup and that the games can go fairly long. Now, that one specific matchup where the deck was pretty good in the head-to-head was against Dimir midrange, like the classic Dimir midrange, not the bounce deck that we've seen emerge from this event. Seeing Dimir be a good matchup for the deck isn't that surprising to me, since the more traditional style Dimir midrange was a little slow to get going, even if they wound up sneaking in a Kaito, and their smaller tempo plays don't really line up well against our deck that can throw out an army of tokens or a giant 7/7 lifelink flyer sometimes. Now, boarding in our small creature removal and potentially even forcing them to tap down cards like a Glissa from the sideboard don't really seem like an awful idea if you're kind of wondering what you want to put in the sideboard. Having to save Merfolk, I'm sorry, not Merfolk Looter, the other one, the Drowner, Floodpit's Drowner. I'm just thinking the Merfolk Trickster from the Pioneer recap I did not that long ago. But having Floodpit's Drowner have to actually work as a pseudo removal spell on Glissa, otherwise things will get very, very dicey for the deck, is not the worst thing in the world to try to board in, and it taxes their removal, so they're not actually going after some of your bigger things or your overlords. Now, Gruul decks, on the other hand, which was a 1-in-1 matchup for the deck of the MSS, seem a little bit harder, especially when you're playing against them in best of 1 on Arena. The speed of the deck and just how quickly it kills is a big concern for us here. Now, our plan of just kind of chump blocking things over and over again, especially when we're making a bunch of tokens or have like 1/1s that are extremely expendable that we actually want in our graveyard, doesn't really work when you're faced with trample from effects like Monstrous Rage, and they pack just enough burn to threaten things with 2 or less toughness or loyalty from our deck that we really want sticking in play. Now, this is where the army of removal spells from our sideboard really comes in handy. Cut Down, Anoint with Affliction, and Maelstrom Pulse are all removal spells that can handle creatures, while we also wind up being able to upgrade to Harvester of Misery, which plays a similar role early game if you discard it, and then the Sweeper effect off of a Squirmergence later in the game can really deal some damage against these decks. The Skyfisher Spider is also pretty good here, as it can gain us life on the way out the door, and it's just big enough that a Torch the Tower doesn't necessarily exile it cleanly. Dissection Tools, giving a renewable source of lifelink, is also a pretty decent card here, but we do have to be aware of Screaming Nemesis shenanigans, especially during combat when they can shut off your life gain by kind of hitting their own creature with a Witchstalker's Frenzy or a burn spell of their own and being able to just cut off your lifelink before damage is actually done. Traditionally now, you would also board out your small mono creatures in matchups where they would just eat removal anyway, or if you anticipate your opponent bringing in more spells to deal with them. Cutting Llanowar Elf against Fatal Push decks in older formats and versions of Standard was a big example of this style of sideboarding. So although speed is crucial here, that's kind of where I've been leaning towards making my cuts, and it's been working out okay for me. It's not a perfect science. You could also cut the top end Atraxa if you think that they're going to be bringing in Paw Patch Formation, which will cleanly deal with your Atraxa, or if you're cutting any Squirming Emergences from your list. Now, you don't want to cut too many creatures, especially on the lower end, because that is going to wind up hindering your overall explosive Tyvar and Insidious Roots turns. So I would be looking at potentially Llanowar Elves, Squirming Emergence, and if you feel like you're never going to get there, Atraxa, and bringing in the Harvester of Misery in that Atraxa spot, while trying to put in as many creatures as possible to make up for the fodder that you're going to lose by taking out some of your smaller 1-drops. Now, matchups that utilize their own graveyard in general should be good matchups for us as long as we can find our scavenging units before they're able to really do the thing the deck is designed to do. That means that like larger Reanimator decks are generally pretty good for us, or the ones that are trying to bring back like Omniscience from their graveyard over and over again, or replay it over and over again. But decks like Azorius Oculus may end up being tougher matchups due to their reanimation effects happening on turn 2 or turn 3 at the earliest. The longer an eyeball stays afloat, the more their deck goes wide as well, which we're not super adept at dealing with, and it might be hard if we don't get our own roots down early and have reach blockers to keep Tyvar alive. Now, Harvester of Misery and Tranquil Throwback can help us out here, and I'd be tempted to try Nissa Ascended Animist if we can force a longer game with some removal sided in as well, and then just slamming Nissa, having an army of plant tokens on the battlefield already, and then trampling over their army of manifest tokens or some of their 4 or 5 toughness flyers to really just kind of seal the deal, get some beneficial trades for us, and eat them from the graveyard after. Most of the control decks of the format end up being a little bit slow for our deck, or from their side. They're too slow to deal with it, such as Domain Control and the Caretaker's talent lists. Our deck relies on the graveyard to function, so keeping a couple of creatures in there when you expect your opponent to Sunfall is a good idea to rebuild when they have to pull the trigger on your plant army. It also makes the fact that they are sometimes putting in extra copies of Day of Judgment instead of Temporary Lockdown in their main decks even worse for them against us in the head-to-head. Temporary Lockdown is something that is a beater against us, and why we have so many copies of cards like Cankerbloom in the sideboard, so that we can get rid of that enchantment that completely exiles everything except for Tyvar and Overlord and Atraxa that lives on our battlefield. So these are going to be things you kind of have to keep in mind from the sideboard when you are going head to head against these decks, and they may be boarding out some of their slower, worse off removal against you. There are also a lot of times where said Day of Judgment winds up happening, or even a Sunfall winds up happening, and I get completely wiped out, but then I untap and then wind up making more creatures than I started with on the board because I have a Scavenging Ooze in hand or in my graveyard. They can't get rid of my Tyvar because they're not profitably attacking into it to reduce its loyalty too much, and I just scooze, eat something from my graveyard, and start the plant chain, and then pass the turn back to them with a larger army than they destroyed. The Golgari Roots deck has ultimately been just a lot of fun for me to play with and crack open like a graveyard-fueled puzzle in some of my games. Even when I wind up fizzling out or doing stone cold nothing, I'm actually just enjoying getting to cast Tyvar in Standard alongside his buddy Llanowar Elves. So do you think that this Roots deck has legs, stalks, trunks to stand up in the Standard metagame? Do plants stand up that way? I don't know. Maybe they're ants. Or this one best left in the dirt for now until we get a couple more cards from newer sets or Standard meta kind of fluctuates. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and while you're there, you can give this video a thumbs up if you are a Tyvar fan like me. Now, speaking of fans, I want to take a moment to shout out all of my members who made this video specifically, as well as all of the videos on my channel, possible through their support. If you would like to join them in membership perks such as access to early content, personal deck techs, Discord access, and much more, just press the join button that's down below the video or over on the main homepage of my channel so you can show your devotion. Now, if you are craving more content, you could of course tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and just general Magic content from me. Now, go make Sepultura proud.